Cowboy woke to Apache watching him, and the mark on her wrist altered his future. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. Jack West woke up to the sound of a soft wind rustling through the trees. It was a peaceful morning on his ranch, the kind of quiet solitude he'd grown used to over the years. The sun was just beginning to rise over the rugged landscape, casting a golden light across the open fields. Jack stretched and rubbed his eyes, still feeling the weight of another long night spent alone in the vast emptiness of the land. He stood up, brushing the dirt from his worn clothes, and stepped outside his modest cabin. As he did, he froze. A woman stood a few feet away, watching him from the edge of the clearing. She was unlike anyone he had ever seen. Her dark, long hair framed a striking face, and her piercing eyes were fixed on him with an intensity he couldn't explain. But it wasn't just her gaze that held his attention. It was the strange mark on her wrist. The pattern was unfamiliar to him, a symbol that seemed almost ancient, like something carved into her skin by hands that had long passed. Jack's heart skipped a beat as he noticed the way the woman seemed to be waiting for him to say something, to react. She didn't speak, didn't move, just stood there in the early morning light, her presence almost otherworldly. Jack couldn't quite place it, but something about her felt like a message, an omen of some kind. He wasn't used to this kind of interaction. He was a rancher, used to the sound of cattle, the silence of the open plains, and the occasional visit from a neighbor. But this was different. The woman, who didn't seem to be a stranger to the land, watched him with the kind of quiet assurance that made Jack feel both uneasy and strangely drawn to her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he managed to speak, his voice rough from sleep. "Who are you?" The woman didn't answer right away. Instead, she moved slightly, as if shifting into a more comfortable position, but never breaking eye contact. Her presence seemed to fill the space between them, making the air feel thick with unspoken words. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, almost too calm. "I've been watching you, Jack West." The words sent a shiver down his spine. "Watching me?" Jack repeated, his mind racing. He wasn't sure if he should feel flattered, worried, or something else entirely. "Yes," she said. "And I know what you've done." Jack's mind whirled as he tried to make sense of her words. He had done plenty in his life, some things he regretted, others he had pushed to the back of his mind. But what did she mean by this? He took a step closer, squinting at the mark on her wrist, trying to make sense of it. It was a swirl of symbols, something that looked like it had been branded into her skin. Jack didn't know much about tribal markings, but he had heard stories about the Apache and their ancient traditions. Something told him that this woman's presence, and that mark, were no coincidence. "What do you know?" Jack asked, his voice tight with both curiosity and apprehension. The woman looked down at her wrist, her eyes briefly softening as if recalling something from a distant past. "This mark," she said, her voice quieter now, "was left for you. It's a message, Jack. One that you're meant to understand." Jack's mind raced again, his thoughts bouncing from one possibility to the next. Was this some kind of warning? A sign that something was coming? Or perhaps, something had already happened, and he had simply missed it? The silence between them grew heavy. He could feel it in his bones, the weight of something ancient, something inevitable. And then, as if the moment had finally arrived, she spoke again. "Your past has caught up with you, Jack West. And now you'll have to face it." Jack's heart beat faster. This wasn't just some random encounter. This woman, the mark on her wrist, it all meant something. Something he couldn't ignore any longer. His future, as uncertain as it had always been, was now tied to her, and to the mysterious message she carried with her. What had he done? And how would he face what was coming? The answers were out there, waiting for him to find them. And somehow, he knew that the woman standing before him was the key. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the ranch. Jack stood still, the strange woman in front of him, her presence unsettling, yet strangely familiar. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change, that his quiet, solitary life was no longer his to control. She watched him in silence, her gaze unwavering, the mark on her wrist glinting faintly in the light. Jack had seen marks like it before in stories told by old traders and travelers, symbols that spoke of old promises, ancient bloodlines, and debts long overdue. He shifted uneasily, his boots scraping the dust beneath him as he took a step back, still unsure of what was happening. "What do you want from me?" Jack asked, his voice low, thick with the weight of 1,000 unspoken questions. The woman didn't respond immediately. Instead, she glanced at the horizon, her expression distant, as if looking at something only she could see. Jack followed her gaze but saw nothing but the endless stretch of land. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, yet carried a strength that made his chest tighten. "You've already done your part, Jack West. The time for answers has come." Jack's brow furrowed, confusion swirling in his mind. "My part? I don't understand. What are you talking about?" She turned to him then, her eyes locking onto his with a gaze that seemed to pierce through him. "Your past has a way of catching up to you," she said quietly. "And so does mine." The words hung in the air between them like a thick fog. Jack couldn't breathe. He was sure he'd never seen this woman before in his life, yet her words, her presence, felt like they were tied to something deep within him. Something he had buried long ago. "I've done nothing," he said, almost to himself. "I've lived here, kept to myself, done no harm." She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached up and touched the mark on her wrist, a simple yet intricate design that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The gesture was almost reverent. "That mark," she said, her voice now barely a whisper, "was left for you, Jack. A message, one that you couldn't ignore forever." He felt his heart rate quicken as the weight of her words settled in. The mark, the strange feeling of familiarity, the eerie sense that he was part of something much larger than himself, it all began to make sense. "Who are you?" Jack asked again, the question now more urgent. She looked at him, her eyes softening for a brief moment, before she answered with a quiet certainty. "I am Nayeli, daughter of the Redstone Apache." The words hit him like a thunderclap. Jack had heard of the Redstone Apache, of course. Stories of their strength, their connection to the land, and their fierce protection of their people. He had never imagined one of their own would stand before him, in his own home. "I don't know what you want from me," Jack said, his voice shaky. "I have nothing to give." Nayeli took a step closer, the air between them thick with tension. "You have more than you realize," she replied. "And you have a choice to make." Jack's mind raced, but before he could speak again, she held up her hand, silencing him. "This is not a decision for you to make alone," she said. "It's one we must make together, or not at all." Jack looked at her, unsure of what she meant. He felt a sense of urgency growing inside him, as though time was running out. The silence stretched on, heavy and oppressive. And then, with a sigh, Nayeli turned her gaze back to the horizon. "Your actions have consequences, Jack West," she said softly. "And the time has come for you to face them." The air seemed to crackle with unspoken understanding. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he knew one thing for certain: his life, the life he had carefully built here on this ranch, was about to be torn apart, whether he was ready or not. The wind blew through the open plains, carrying with it a sense of something shifting. Jack stood there, staring at Nayeli, her presence still as unsettling as it was mysterious. He could feel the weight of her words pressing down on him, and the mark on her wrist, glowing faintly in the early morning light, seemed to call to him like a distant memory. "What do you mean by facing my actions?" Jack asked, his voice tight with a mix of fear and curiosity. Nayeli turned to him, her eyes calm but filled with a quiet intensity. "You've lived in isolation, Jack, she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. But isolation does not protect you from the past. It never can. Jack felt his stomach tighten as the reality of her words sank in. He had spent so many years here on his ranch, thinking that by staying away from the world, he could escape the mistakes he had made. But now, in the presence of this woman, he realized how naive he had been. I never meant to hurt anyone, he muttered, almost to himself. I've done what I had to do to survive. Nayeli's expression softened, but only slightly. Survival is a choice, Jack, she said quietly. But sometimes the cost of survival is more than you can bear. The silence that followed was heavy, each word hanging between them like a storm waiting to break. Jack shifted uncomfortably, his mind racing. He wanted to ask her more, about the mark, about her past, about what exactly he was being asked to face, but the words wouldn't come. Nayeli seemed to sense his hesitation. You can choose to turn away, she said, her voice firm. But that will not change what is already set in motion. The choice is yours, but it's one you must make now. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He had always believed that he could control his own fate, that he could stay hidden, stay quiet, and the past would eventually fade away. But now, it seemed the past was knocking on his door, and it wasn't going away. And if I choose not to face it? Jack asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Nayeli's gaze never wavered. Then you will live with the consequences, as we all do. But remember, Jack, not all consequences are immediate. Some take years to unfold, but they always come. Her words echoed in his mind long after she stopped speaking. The weight of them settled over him like a cloud, dark and foreboding. Jack felt as if he were standing on the edge of something, a precipice, and he didn't know if he was about to fall or if he could still pull himself back. He thought about his life here on the ranch, the years he had spent alone, trying to outrun the ghosts of his past. But what if those ghosts were now catching up to him, and what if Nayeli, with her cryptic message, was part of that reckoning? He looked out across the land, the rolling hills and endless sky that had always felt like freedom to him. But now, that freedom seemed fragile, as if it were held together by threads that were slowly starting to unravel. What do you want from me, Nayeli? Jack asked, his voice breaking the silence that had stretched between them. She stepped closer, her presence commanding yet calm. I want you to understand that your choices have led you here. You can run no longer. It's time to face what you've left behind. The wind picked up again, the sound of it sweeping across the plains filling the space around them. Jack felt as though the world was holding its breath, waiting for him to make his decision. He knew deep down that he couldn't keep running forever. The past, with all its mistakes and regrets, was here now, standing before him in the form of Nayeli and the mark on her wrist. And he had to face it, no matter the cost. The silence between them stretched, and Jack felt as though the weight of the entire world had settled on his shoulders. The choice Nayeli spoke of, whether to face his past or let it consume him, was not one he had expected to confront today, and certainly not like this. He had hoped, for so long, that his time here on the ranch would shield him from the mistakes he had made in the past. But the past, it seemed, was always waiting. What do you want me to do? Jack finally asked, his voice filled with a mixture of uncertainty and resolve. Nayeli's eyes remained steady, calm, but with a depth that Jack could not comprehend. She had seen something in him, something he had long buried, and now, he was being asked to confront it. You have to make peace with what you've done, Jack, she said, her voice gentle but firm. You cannot move forward until you do. Jack stood still, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched the edge of his shirt. He had spent years building walls around himself, walls that had kept out the guilt, the shame, and the haunting memories of the past. But now, those walls were crumbling. Peace, he muttered under his breath, almost bitterly. I don't know if I can find that. Nayeli stepped closer, her presence unwavering. It's not about finding peace, Jack. It's about accepting what you did, owning it, and letting go of the guilt. Only then can you truly be free. Her words hit Jack harder than he expected. For years he had run from his past, avoiding the people, the places, the memories that would remind him of the choices he had made. He had convinced himself that the isolation of the ranch, the solitude he had carved out for himself, was his penance. But now, standing before Nayeli, he realized it was just a prison. A prison of his own making. "How do I even start?" Jack asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How do I make peace with something like that?" Nayeli was silent for a moment, as if considering his question carefully. "You start by acknowledging it," she said at last. "You have to see the truth of it, no matter how hard it is. Only then can you begin to heal." Jack took a deep breath, the weight of her words sinking in. He had spent so long hiding from the truth, pretending it didn't exist. But here, now, in the presence of this woman, he couldn't escape it anymore. The truth was there, staring him in the face. He had to face it. He had to face the choices he had made, the people he had wronged. He had to face the man he used to be, the one who had let his fear and anger dictate his actions. Jack closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the cool breeze against his skin, and let the memories flood back, memories of things he had long tried to forget. He remembered the anger, the confusion, the sense of betrayal. He remembered the feeling of power he had once held, the feeling that he was justified in his actions. But now, with every passing moment, that justification felt more and more hollow. "I don't know if I can ever make up for what I've done," Jack said, the words heavy with regret. Nayeli's gaze softened, and she stepped forward, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to make up for it, Jack," she said. "You just have to start by facing it. And then you can move forward." Jack nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling deep within him. He wasn't sure what the future held, or if he could ever truly make peace with the past. But for the first time in years, he felt a small glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. And maybe, with Nayeli's help, he could find it. Jack stood there for a moment, the weight of Nayeli's words lingering in the air. The breeze, once cool and refreshing, now felt almost heavy, as though it carried the burden of 1,000 unspoken truths. For years, Jack had believed that by staying alone on this ranch, far from the world and its troubles, he could avoid confronting the mistakes he had made. But now, standing in front of Nayeli, it was clear that running had never been an option. His past had found him, and no amount of distance or silence could change that. He had been wrong all along. He glanced at Nayeli, who stood calmly, her presence unwavering. Her eyes, filled with something that was part sympathy, part something deeper, seemed to see straight through him. "What now?" he asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "How do I even begin to make sense of this?" Nayeli studied him for a long moment before answering. "You begin by understanding that it's not about fixing everything, Jack," she said softly. "It's about accepting the consequences, no matter how difficult it may be." Jack ran a hand through his hair, his mind swirling with the weight of her words. Consequences. He had spent years trying to avoid them, but now he realized they were always there, waiting for him to face them. "I don't know if I can do this," Jack admitted, his voice low. "It's too much. Too many things I've done, too many things I've run from." Nayeli's expression softened, and she took a small step forward, closing the distance between them. "You don't have to do it alone," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "I'm here. You're not the only one who has had to face what they've done." Jack looked at her, surprised by the sincerity in her eyes. For the first time since their encounter began, he felt something like a spark of hope, though it was faint. She was right. He didn't have to do this alone. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for redemption, for peace. But it would take more than just facing the past. It would take courage, the kind of courage Jack had never needed before, the kind that came from acknowledging the full weight of his actions. "What happens now?" Jack asked, his voice steadier than before. Nayeli nodded, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "No," she said. "We go back. We face what's waiting, and we make it right." Jack felt his heart quicken at her words. There was no turning back now. He had to face the truth, and he had to do it soon. As much as he wanted to retreat, to run back to the quiet comfort of his ranch, he knew it was no longer an option. Nayeli's words, her presence, had given him a glimpse of what could be if he took the first step. A life without regret, without fear. It wasn't going to be easy. He knew that. But for the first time in years, Jack felt a flicker of something inside him, something that wasn't fear, something that wasn't shame. It was hope. The kind of hope that had been buried beneath years of regret. He wasn't sure how this would all play out, but he knew one thing for sure: he had to try. He had to face the past, and he had to do it now. Jack nodded, taking a deep breath as he looked out over the land. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "Let's go." With that, they turned and began walking back towards the heart of the land, where everything had started, and where everything would change. Jack didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't move forward without facing the past. And for the first time in a long while, he was ready to do just that. The journey back to the heart of the land was quiet, the only sounds being the crunch of their boots on the dry earth, and the distant calls of birds overhead. Jack walked alongside Nayeli, his mind heavy with the weight of the decisions he had made, and the decisions yet to come. As they moved, he couldn't help but think about everything that had led him to this moment. The years of solitude, of burying himself in work to avoid facing the past. He had always thought he was safe, that by living on this ranch, far from people, he could escape the consequences of his actions. But now, with Nayeli beside him, he realized how wrong he had been. "How do you do it?" Jack asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Nayeli glanced at him, her eyes steady, knowing. "Do what?" she asked. "Live with it," Jack replied. "The past. The things you've done." Nayeli was quiet for a moment, as if considering his question carefully. "I don't live with it," she said softly. "I let it go. I can't change what happened. I can only control what I do now." Jack turned to her, seeing a depth in her eyes that he hadn't noticed before. There was a strength there, but also a sorrow. "I don't know if I can do that," he admitted. "Let it go." She smiled faintly, her lips barely curving upward. "You can't," she said. "But it's not easy. You'll have to face it first." Jack nodded slowly, though he wasn't entirely sure he believed her. The thought of letting go of the past, of forgiving himself for the things he had done, seemed impossible. How could he ever move past it? How could he forgive himself for things that had hurt others? The sun was now high in the sky, and the shadows of the trees stretched long across the land. Jack could see the ranch in the distance, its familiar buildings standing like silent witnesses to the years he had spent here. It seemed like a lifetime ago that he had first come to this land, looking for peace, looking for a place to escape. But now, as they neared the ranch, he realized that the peace he had been searching for wasn't here. It had never been here. It was something he would have to find within himself. As they reached the edge of the ranch, Jack stopped and looked out across the land. The open field stretched for miles, and the distant mountains loomed, silent and imposing. "This is where it all started," Jack said quietly. "Where I ran to. Where I thought I could escape." Nayeli stood beside him, her gaze fixed on the same distant horizon. "You can't escape the past," she said. "But you can face it. And when you do, you can finally be free." Jack looked at her, the weight of her words settling in. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something inside him, a small, fragile hope. Maybe Nayeli was right. Maybe this was the moment he had been waiting for. The moment he would stop running and finally face what he had done. The moment he would stop hiding behind the walls he had built around himself. "All right," Jack said, his voice steady. "I'm ready." Nayeli nodded, and together they walked toward the ranch. Jack knew that the road ahead would not be easy. But as he took the first step, he also knew that it was the only road worth taking. The ranch seemed different now. The land that had once been a place of escape, a haven of solitude, now felt like a weight pressing down on Jack's chest. As he walked alongside Nayeli, the familiar surroundings, the fields, the barn, the house, it all seemed so distant, as though he were seeing it for the first time. He had lived here for years, working the land, keeping to himself, but now it felt like a prison, a place filled with memories that he had tried so hard to bury. Jack stopped in front of the barn, his eyes fixed on the weathered wood. "I've spent so much time here," he said quietly, his voice almost lost in the wind. "And for what?" "To avoid everything that's happened, to run from my mistakes." Nayeli stood beside him, her gaze steady as always. "You can't run forever, Jack," she said gently. "Eventually, everything catches up to you." Jack nodded, taking a deep breath. "I know," he replied. "And now it's time to face it." They walked toward the house, and as they approached, Jack felt a tightness in his chest. He had been avoiding this moment, putting it off for as long as he could, but now he couldn't avoid it any longer. The past was here, standing before him, and it was time to confront it. He stepped onto the porch and paused, his hand resting on the doorframe. "What if I'm not strong enough?" Jack asked, the uncertainty creeping into his voice. "What if I can't do this?" Nayeli's voice was soft but firm. "You are strong enough, Jack. You just have to believe it." Jack looked at her, and for the first time, he saw something in her eyes, something that wasn't just empathy, but understanding. She knew what it was like to face the past, to deal with the consequences of actions that could never be undone. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "Let's go inside." They entered the house, and Jack felt the weight of the memories flooding back. The worn furniture, the old photographs on the walls. This house had been his refuge, but now it felt like a reminder of everything he had tried to forget. He walked into the living room, his eyes scanning the room. "This is where it all happened," he murmured, almost to himself. "Where I made my choices." Nayeli didn't say anything, but her presence was comforting. She didn't push him, didn't rush him. She was just there, letting him take his time. Jack sat down on the old leather chair, the familiar creak of the worn seat echoing in the quiet room. "I thought if I stayed here long enough, everything would just go away," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "But it didn't. It's still here with me." Nayeli sat down across from him, her eyes never leaving his. "The past doesn't go away, Jack. But it doesn't have to control you. You can choose how to move forward." Jack looked at her, his mind racing. Could he really let go of the guilt? Could he face the people he had hurt and find a way to make things right? He wasn't sure. The fear of what he had done, of the damage he had caused, was overwhelming. But something inside him shifted, something that felt like hope, a tiny spark. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way to find peace. "I don't know where to start," Jack admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "But I'm ready to try." Nayeli smiled, the faintest of smiles, and nodded. "That's all you need, Jack. A willingness to try." Jack took a deep breath and looked around the room once more. For the first time, it didn't feel like a prison. It felt like a place where he could begin again. "All right," he said again, his voice more certain this time. "Let's do it." He stood up, ready to face whatever came next. Ready to confront the past and begin the long road to redemption. He didn't know how long it would take or if it would even be possible. But for the first time in years, Jack felt like he was taking the first step towards something better. Something real. Jack stepped outside the house, the sun now hanging low in the sky. The day had passed in quiet reflection, but the weight of the past still lingered heavily on his shoulders. He had made the decision to face it, but as the shadows grew longer, he felt the uncertainty creeping back in. How would he ever make things right? How could he undo the hurt he had caused? His mind raced with 1,000 questions, each more daunting than the last. Nayeli stood beside him, her presence steady and reassuring, as though she could sense his turmoil. "You're doing the right thing," she said, her voice calm. Jack glanced at her, searching her face for reassurance, for something that would give him a clear path forward. "But how do I start?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Nayeli didn't respond immediately, her gaze drifting across the horizon, as if the land itself held the answers. The first step, she said softly, is to face those you've hurt. And to own your part in it. It's not about fixing everything all at once. It's about being honest, with them and with yourself. Jack nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling in. He had spent so long running from the truth, avoiding the people he had wronged, hiding from the consequences of his actions. But now, he knew he had to confront it all. He couldn't keep hiding. He turned his eyes back to the ranch, the place that had been both his refuge and his prison. I can't change what I did, he said quietly, almost to himself. But I can try to make it right. Nayeli met his gaze, her eyes filled with understanding. That's all anyone can ask of you, she said gently. To try. To own your actions and work to make amends. Jack took a deep breath, feeling the tension in his chest slowly ease. It wouldn't be easy, he knew that, but he couldn't keep living in the shadow of his past. He had to step into the light, no matter how painful it might be. He squared his shoulders, the weight of the decision still pressing down on him, but now there was something else there, resolve. He wasn't sure what would come next, but he knew one thing for certain, he couldn't let fear control him anymore. He had to take the first step, even if it meant confronting the people he had wronged, even if it meant facing his own mistakes. Let's go, he said, his voice steady, the uncertainty still there, but now tempered by a quiet determination. Nayeli gave him a small, approving nod, and together they walked toward the future, whatever it might hold. Jack didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know how those he had hurt would react, or if he could ever truly make amends. But he was willing to try. And for the first time in a long while, that was enough. He was ready to face the past, to take responsibility, and to move forward, one step at a time. As Jack and Nayeli approached the ranch, Jack could feel his heart pounding in his chest. The land, which had once been his sanctuary, now felt foreign. He had spent years here, trying to outrun his past, but now it was here, waiting for him to face it. He could see the familiar shape of the barn in the distance, the worn fence posts lining the property, but it was no longer just a place. It was the backdrop of everything he had tried to forget. He stopped for a moment, his hand resting on the worn railing of the porch, looking out over the land. I've been running for so long, Jack said quietly, almost to himself. I thought if I stayed here long enough, I could outrun it. But now I see, it was never about where I was. It was about what I was avoiding. Nayeli stood beside him, her presence steady and reassuring, as though she had known all along what it would take for him to see the truth. It's not the place, Jack, she said softly. It's what's inside of you. You can't hide from yourself, no matter how far you go. Jack looked at her, his heart heavy with the realization that she was right. All these years, he had thought that isolation would keep him safe, that by keeping to himself, he could escape the consequences of his past decisions. But now, it was clear, he could no longer run. I don't know if I'm ready for this, Jack admitted, his voice shaky. What if they don't forgive me? What if they don't want to hear what I have to say? Nayeli's eyes were steady, and her voice was filled with a calm wisdom that Jack had come to rely on. Forgiveness is not something you can control, Jack. But honesty, that's something you can offer. You can face the truth and make amends, even if it takes time. What matters is that you try. Jack nodded slowly, taking a deep breath. The weight of what he had to do still felt overwhelming, but for the first time, he felt like he could take that first step. He had spent so long running from the people he had hurt, from the mistakes he had made. But now, standing here, with Nayeli by his side, he knew he had to face them. He had to face the consequences of his actions, no matter how difficult it might be. He walked toward the door, the familiar creak of the floorboards beneath his feet grounding him in the moment. All right, Jack said, his voice steadier now. I'm ready. He opened the door and stepped inside, the cool air of the house wrapping around him. The room, once a place of refuge, now felt different, charged with the energy of the moment. He could almost feel the weight of the past pressing in on him, waiting for him to speak. He turned to Nayeli, who stood just behind him, her presence a quiet strength. I'm going to talk to them, Jack said, his voice firm now. I have to. Nayeli nodded, her expression soft but filled with understanding. I'll be here, she said simply. Jack stepped forward, the familiar path ahead of him both comforting and terrifying. As he walked, he felt a small shift inside of him, a quiet but undeniable strength. This was it. There was no turning back now. He didn't know what the outcome would be. He didn't know if he could make up for the hurt he had caused, but he was going to try. For the first time in years, Jack felt like he was on the path to something real, something that might finally bring him the peace he had been searching for. The past had caught up with him, but now, he was ready to face it, head on.